I know why you clicked. You saw that thumbnail. That doe-eyed beauty giving that digger the kind of look that could stop a mortar round midair. And you read, "They thrust deep into the base." And knowing you boys, I know exactly where your mind went. Hell, my mind went there too, and I'm the one who wrote it. But let me tell you something. The only thrusting that matters in this story happened at 0200 hours on the night of August 18th, 1966, in the red dirt of Phuoc Tuy Province, South Vietnam. And what got thrust was several hundred very angry Viet Cong sappers, suicide squads, and main force regulars, right into the perimeter wire of a small Australian fire base called Nui Dat. And brother, what happened next is the kind of story they don't teach you in any classroom, but every man who was there never forgot. Not for a single night of the rest of his life. Now, before we get into the blood and the mud and the wire, let me set the scene for you boys who weren't in country, or maybe you were just a little too far north to catch this particular piece of the war. It's 1966. The monsoon season is doing what monsoon seasons do, turning the ground into soup and the air into something you could practically chew. The Australians have been operating out of Nui Dat for just a few months. They're part of the 1st Australian Task Force, and they've set up shop in the middle of Phuoc Ty like a man who just moved into a rough neighborhood and decided to mow his lawn nice and neat to let everyone know he's staying. The problem is the neighborhood, Charlie's neighborhood, didn't appreciate the new tenants one damn bit. Now, here's where you need to understand something about the Australians that a lot of American boys didn't fully appreciate until they'd shared a few warm bottles of Ba Moi Ba with them in some bar in Vung Tau. The diggers were different. Not better or worse than the American grunts. Lord knows those American boys were brave as anything that ever walked the earth. But different in a very particular way. The Aussies came from a tradition of bush warfare. Their grandfathers fought at Gallipoli. Their fathers fought in the jungles of New Guinea against the Japanese. They understood that in this kind of war, patience was a weapon. Silence was a weapon. Knowing the ground under your boots like you knew your own backyard, that was a weapon. They didn't just occupy the jungle, they became part of it. The Americans, God love them, and I do, every last grunt who humped that 60-pound ruck through the heat and the red dust, the Americans fought the war they were trained to fight. Big firepower, air support, artillery. You find Charlie, you call in the fast movers, you saturate the coordinates, you win by sheer overwhelming force. And against a conventional enemy, brother, that works like a charm. But Charlie wasn't conventional. Charlie was patient. Charlie was local. Charlie knew every route and every river and every spider hole between the DMZ and the Mekong Delta. And Charlie had a plan for Nui Dat. The unit that came for the Australians that August night was the 275th Viet Cong Regiment, reinforced with elements of the D445 Provincial Mobile Unit. These weren't farmers with rifles. These were hardened, experienced soldiers who had been fighting, some of them, since before the Americans ever set foot in country. They'd been watching Nui Dat. They'd been counting heads, mapping patrol routes, identifying weak points in the wire. And they'd decided that the time had come to send the diggers a very loud message. The plan was a ground assault. A human wave attack combined with sapper infiltration, designed to overrun the base, destroy as much equipment as possible, kill as many Australians as they could, and fade back into the rubber plantations before dawn. It was a bold plan. It was a professional plan. And for about the first 30 minutes of that night, it looked like it might just work. The attack began around 0300 hours with mortars. Nothing wakes you up quite like a mortar round landing 40 meters from your head. Any man who's been through it will tell you. There's a particular sound, a particular quality to the air in those first few seconds that your body understands before your brain does. The Australians in their fighting pits were up and on their weapons almost before the first round hit. And this is where the training starts to matter. Because a man who panics in those first 60 seconds is a dead man. A man whose muscle memory takes over, whose hands find his weapon and his eyes find his sector, and his breathing stays controlled. That man has a chance. The sappers came through the wire at multiple points simultaneously. These weren't amateur infiltrators. Viet Cong sappers were among the most skilled light infantry in the world at that particular moment in history. Trained to move through wire obstacles, minefields, and trip flares in near total darkness, wearing nothing but shorts and grease, carrying satchel charges and AK-47s. They were brave in the way that men who've already decided they're going to die are brave, which is to say, completely. They moved through the outer wire with a precision that would have impressed any special operations instructor on Earth. But here's where the story takes a turn that Charlie did not expect. The Australians had prepared their defensive positions with a particular kind of care that went beyond what most people would call standard military procedure. The diggers were meticulous. They knew the ground. They'd walked every inch of that perimeter in daylight, studying fields of fire, identifying dead ground, pre-registering their weapons on known approach routes. When the attack came, they didn't just react, they executed. Section commanders kept their men calm. Junior NCOs made decisions without waiting for orders from above. The communication up and down the chain was fast, accurate, and professional. And here is the crucial difference. The thing that saved Nui Dat that night. The Australians had pre-positioned their defensive fires with an almost obsessive attention to detail. Their artillery support, their mortars, their machine gun positions, everything was laid out in interlocking arcs that left almost no dead ground anywhere in the approach. When the 275th Regiment came in, they walked into a wall of fire that had been mathematically designed to be exactly where they were. It wasn't luck. It wasn't improvisation. It was weeks of quiet, careful preparation by men who understood that the best time to solve a problem is before the problem arrives. Now let me contrast this with what was happening to American units operating in similar circumstances during that same period. Because this is where the story gets interesting, and where a few of the boys who are watching this might have some very personal memories. American fire support bases in 1966 were formidable installations. They had more firepower, more resources, more everything than the Australians could dream of. A typical American firebase had helicopter gunships on call, fast air a radio call away, artillery that could reach out 30 kilometers and touch someone. The firepower was extraordinary. Nobody argues that point. But there was a problem. A problem that didn't come from the grunts. God, no. The grunts were magnificent. The problem came from the brass. See, American tactical doctrine in Vietnam in 1966 was still wrestling with a fundamental question that nobody at MACV seemed willing to answer honestly. Are we fighting a conventional war or a counterinsurgency? The answer, obviously, painfully obviously, was counterinsurgency. But the generals, the people with stars on their collars sitting in air-conditioned offices in Saigon, kept trying to fight it like a conventional war. Keep the big units together, maximize firepower. Measure progress in body counts. Don't let your men spend too long in one place learning the terrain, because that smells too much like you're settling in. And we don't settle in. We project force. So American infantry companies rotated through areas of operation frequently. They'd be in one valley for 3 weeks, then lifted to another province, then sent to sweep a different river valley. The result, and any grunt who humped the boonies in those years will tell you this, was that you were always a stranger to the ground. You never quite knew the terrain the way you needed to know it. You couldn't build the kind of patient, intimate knowledge of an area that the Australians were building in Phuc Tuy. And Charlie knew it. Charlie always knew it. Charlie had all the time in the world. The Battle of Long Tan, which is what history calls what happened at Nui Dat and the rubber plantation nearby, ended with the 275th Regiment taking catastrophic casualties. The exact numbers are still debated, but somewhere between 200 and 300 Viet Cong dead against 18 Australian killed in action. 18. Against a force that outnumbered them between 10 and 15 to 1. It was one of the most remarkable defensive actions of the entire Vietnam War. And it happened because a relatively small group of professional soldiers, most of them young men, some of them barely past their teens, trusted their training, trusted their preparation, trusted each other, and held the line. D Company, 6th Battalion, Royal Australian Regiment. That's the unit that bore the brunt of it. They'd been out on patrol when the attack developed. They found themselves in the middle of the rubber plantation, in the driving rain, surrounded on 3 sides, outnumbered by a factor that would have given any rational man excellent reason to run. They didn't run. They fought, with the particular stubbornness that seems to be built into the Australian military character at a genetic level. They fought for hours. They called for fire. They coordinated. They kept their discipline. And when the ammunition started running critically low, the kind of low where men start doing math they'd rather not be doing, 2 RAF Iroquois helicopters flew through what was effectively a wall of anti-aircraft fire to deliver ammunition resupply. The pilots of those helicopters deserve their own documentary, and maybe one day they'll get one. Now here's something that doesn't get talked about enough when people tell the story of Long Tan, the American contribution that night. Because this is not a story about Americans failing and Australians succeeding. This is a story about what happens when professional soldiers work together, trust each other, and cover each other's backs the way men are supposed to. The artillery support that helped break the back of the 275th Regiment's attack included fire from American 155mm howitzers. American gunners, American ammunition, American steel, arriving on target with the kind of precision that saves lives. Those boys didn't ask whether the men they were protecting were Australian or American or Martian. They just did their jobs, and they did them well. And 18 Australians came home instead of 180. That matters. That always matters. But let's talk about what happened in the days and weeks after Long Tan. Because this is where the Australian approach to the war in Phuc Tuy starts to game truly fascinating. Most military forces, after repelling a major attack, would do one of 2 things. They'd either hunker down and reinforce their defensive positions, or they'd launch a big sweep operation. Lots of men, lots of noise, lots of firepower. Go find Charlie and make him pay. The Americans, under their doctrine at the time, would almost certainly have done the latter. And there's nothing wrong with that impulse. It's a natural impulse. You hit me, I hit you back harder. That's as old as war itself. The Australians did something different. They went quiet. They went patient. They sent out their SAS, their Special Air Service Regiment, in small GK, sometimes just 4 or 6 men, to move through the jungle with the kind of silence that Charlie thought was his GK property. These teams didn't go out looking for a fight. They went out looking for information. Where is Charlie moving? What routes is he using? Where are his caches? Where does he sleep? They would spend days, sometimes a week or more, in the bush, moving so carefully that they left almost no sign of their passage. No broken branches, no footprints if it could be helped, no cooking fires, no unnecessary noise, nothing that would tell a sharp-eyed enemy that death was watching from 40 meters away in the undergrowth. The Australian SAS in Vietnam were, by any objective measure, among the finest reconnaissance soldiers in the world at that time. Their selection process was brutal. Not GDK brutal in the way that modern fitness culture uses that word, but brutal in the old sense, the real sense. Men were pushed past every physical and psychological limit they thought they had, and then pushed further, specifically to find out what they were made of when there was nothing left. The ones who passed weren't necessarily the biggest or the fastest or the strongest. They were the ones who simply refused to quit. And in the jungle, that quality, that absolute refusal to accept defeat, was worth more than any amount of firepower. Their patrol techniques were developed specifically for the Southeast Asian jungle environment, drawing on lessons learned by Australian and British forces during the Malayan emergency in the 1950s. The Brits and Aussies had spent years in the Malayan jungle hunting communist guerrillas, and they'd learned things that couldn't be found in any American field manual. They'd learned that in close jungle, your ears are more important than your eyes. They'd learned that the jungle has a rhythm, a sound, and when that rhythm changes, when the birds go quiet, when the insects stop, something has disturbed it, and you better figure out what before it figures out you. They'd learned that a small team moving with absolute discipline and silence could gather more useful intelligence than a battalion crashing through the undergrowth like a herd of water buffalo. Now, I'm not criticizing the American grunts here, boys, and I want to be very clear about that. I will never criticize the American infantrymen in Vietnam. Those men faced conditions that would break most human beings, and they faced them with a courage that deserves nothing but respect. What I'm criticizing, and I'll criticize it till my last breath, is the system that was imposed on them from above. The body count metrics. The search and destroy doctrine that sent American units thrashing through the jungle, making enough noise to be heard in Hanoi. The rotation policies that meant a company never stayed long enough in one area to really know it. The political constraints that prevented the kind of patient, long-term pacification strategy that might actually have worked. The grunts did everything that was asked of them and more. It was the asking that was the problem. There's a story, and I've heard versions of it from enough men who were there that I believe the core of it is true, about an American infantry company that was operating in Phuoc Tuy province in late 1966, not long after Long Tan. They'd been inserted by helicopter into a valley that Australian SAS teams had been quietly observing for several weeks. The Aussies had identified a major Viet Cong supply route running through that valley, a route that Charlie had been using for months, moving men and materiel under the jungle canopy with remarkable regularity. The plan was to ambush the route, disrupt the supply line, gather intelligence. It was a good plan, a careful plan, the kind of plan that comes from weeks of patient observation. The American company came in on helicopters. Now, helicopter insertions are loud. There is no quiet way to land a dozen Hueys in a valley. Charlie heard them coming from about 10 kilometers away, had plenty of time to melt into the jungle, and by the time the American boys hit the ground and started moving toward the suspected supply route, the only thing moving on that trail was a very confused water buffalo and about 10,000 mosquitoes. The supply route was cold. The intelligence was stale. The weeks of careful Australian reconnaissance had been, in a single afternoon, rendered worthless. The Australians, and I can imagine the expression on the face of the SAS troop commander when he heard about this, did not blame the American grunts. The American grunts were doing exactly what they'd been ordered to do, with the equipment and doctrine they'd been given. The Australians blamed the system, and they were right to. This fundamental difference in approach, the scalpel versus the sledgehammer, as more than one historian has described it, played out in Phuc Tuy province for the better part of 6 years. The Australians maintained operational responsibility for the province from 1966 to 1971, and during that time, they developed an intimate knowledge of the terrain, the local population, the Viet Cong infrastructure, and the main force units operating in the area that was, frankly, unmatched anywhere in the country. They knew which villages had VC sympathizers and which didn't. They knew the personalities of local cadre leaders. They knew the supply routes and the safe houses and the tunnel systems. They knew, in short, everything that you need to know if you want to actually win a counterinsurgency, rather than just suppress it temporarily. Their weapon of choice for this kind of warfare was the patrol. Small unit patrolling was elevated in the Australian task force to something approaching an art form. A typical Australian infantry platoon on patrol in Phuc Tuy moved at a pace that would have driven an American platoon commander absolutely crazy. Slow, deliberate, with long halts for listening, frequent changes of direction to detect and lose any potential followers, careful attention to every piece of sign on the ground. They weren't in a hurry. Being in a hurry got you killed. The jungle rewarded patience and punished impatience with absolute consistency. Their equipment reflected this philosophy. The Australian SL rifle, the L1A1 self-loading rifle, which they called the SLR, was a semi-automatic 7.62 millimeter battle rifle that the Americans had essentially abandoned in favor of the M16. Now, there's been an argument going on about those two weapons since roughly 1966 that still gets heated in certain veterans bars, and I'm not going to settle it tonight. But I'll tell you what the Australians liked about the SLR. It hit hard. It was reliable in mud and humidity, and it reached out to distances that the M16 struggled with in the kind of long-range engagements that sometimes developed in the rubber plantations and rice paddies of Phuc Tuy. For close-in jungle work, the Australians also used the M16 in certain roles, and their SAS teams carried whatever mix of weapons suited the specific mission. They were pragmatic about equipment in a way that institutional armies sometimes aren't. The M60 machine gun was another piece of kit that the Australians used with particular skill. In American units, the M60 was sometimes treated as a fire support weapon. Lay down a base of fire, suppress the enemy, maneuver your rifle squads. The Australians treated it as a precision tool. Their M60 gunners were trained to fire in short, controlled bursts, with a discipline that made every round count. Ammunition resupply in the jungle is not a trivial problem when you're 4 days from the nearest fire base, and the diggers knew it. Now, I promised you a barroom story, and I'm a man of my word, so let me take you to Vung Tau in the summer of 1967. If you were in country during that period, you know Vung Tau. Beautiful place, actually. Beaches, bars, girls, cold beer if you were lucky, and warm beer if you weren't, and a temporary but profound sense that the war was something happening to someone else, somewhere far away. The Americans called it Vung Tau. The Australians called it the same thing, but they said it with a particular fondness that suggested they'd done some serious damage to the local bar economy. There was a bar. I won't tell you the name because frankly I'm not sure any of the men who remember it remember the name, where American and Australian soldiers regularly ended up in the same space at the end of an R&R period. And the conversations that happened in that bar, over bottles of Ba Moi Ba and whatever else was available, were sometimes more educational than anything that happened in any briefing room in Saigon. An American staff sergeant, a grunt's grunt, 12 years in the Army, 2 tours already under his belt. The kind of man whose eyes had seen enough that they'd stopped being surprised by anything, was sitting at the bar one night, nursing a warm 33, when an Australian SAS corporal sat down next to him. The American, being American, offered to buy the next round. The Australian, being Australian, accepted without excessive ceremony and settled in like a man who planned to be there for a while. They got to talking the way soldiers do when they're far enough from the war to be honest about it. The American was frustrated. He'd been running search and destroy operations in War Zone C for 3 months, and the pattern was always the same. Insert by helicopter, move through the jungle, making enough noise to alert every VC within 5 kilometers. Find nothing. Extract by helicopter. Repeat. Occasionally they'd make contact, sudden, violent, disorienting contact, in triple canopy jungle where you couldn't see 10 meters in any direction. Take casualties. Call in air support. And by the time the fast movers finished working over the tree line, Charlie had already disappeared into his tunnel system and was probably having lunch. 3 months of that. 3 months of watching good men get hurt for terrain that they'd abandoned 3 weeks later, and that Charlie would simply walk back into the moment they left. The Australian listened to all of this without interrupting, which itself told you something about the man. He sipped his warm beer. He looked at the ceiling for a moment, and then he said something that the American staff sergeant told me he thought about for the rest of his life. He said, and I'm paraphrasing here because this is a story told third hand over the years. He said, "The problem is you're trying to find him. You should be making him come to you." Now that sounds simple. It sounds like something you'd find in a fortune cookie if fortune cookies were written by men who'd spent significant time getting shot at. But unpack it for a moment, and you'll find something genuinely profound about the nature of counterinsurgency warfare. The Americans were reactive, even when they thought they were being proactive. They'd get intelligence, usually from aerial reconnaissance or signals intercept, that suggested enemy presence in a particular area, and they'd insert a force to go find the enemy. The enemy, who had excellent local intelligence networks and could hear helicopters coming from miles away, would simply not be there when the Americans arrived. The Australians, and this was the essence of what that SAS corporal was describing in that Vung Tau bar, operated differently. They would identify an area of enemy activity through patient, quiet reconnaissance. Then they would position themselves silently in ambush positions along routes the enemy was known to use. And then they would wait. They would wait for hours, sometimes for days. In silence, in stillness, in the heat and the mud and the insects, with the kind of patience that is genuinely superhuman when you think about what these men were enduring physically. And Charlie, who had no idea they were there, would walk into the killing ground, and the ambush would be sprung, with a violence and precision that left very little to discuss afterward. The American staff sergeant asked the obvious question. He asked how you got men to sit still for that long in those conditions. And the Australian said something equally simple and equally profound. He said, "You train them until sitting still feels more comfortable than moving." That philosophy, that absolute mastery of stillness and patience, was the foundation of Australian SAS effectiveness in Vietnam. It sounds almost meditative when you describe it in peacetime terms, sitting here with a drink in a comfortable chair. In practice, in the field, in 40-degree heat with 100% humidity, and insects that treated you as a buffet, and the constant possibility that the man you were watching for might walk past you at arm's length. In those conditions, the ability to remain absolutely motionless and absolutely quiet was one of the hardest things a soldier could be asked to do. The Australians trained for it specifically and deliberately, and it showed. Their ambush techniques were refined to a level of detail that bordered on the obsessive. The positioning of each man in the ambush line, the arcs of fire designed to ensure that nothing could escape the killing ground. The signal to initiate, usually a claymore mine command detonated by the patrol commander, which gave the initiation a controlled, deliberate quality rather than the accidental or premature initiation that plagued less disciplined units. The immediate follow-up actions after the ambush was sprung, moving through the killing ground quickly and professionally to collect intelligence before any enemy reaction force could arrive. Every step of the process was rehearsed until it was automatic, because in the moment of contact there is no time to think. There is only time to act, and the quality of your actions depends entirely on the quality of your preparation. Now the Americans had ambush techniques too, and some American units, the Rangers, certain infantry companies that had been in country long enough to develop their own unofficial adaptations of doctrine, were extremely good at it. But the institutional army, the army of search and destroy and body counts and helicopter assaults, never fully embraced the ambush as its primary tactical tool, the way the Australians did. And the reason, if you want my honest opinion after looking at this question for a long time, comes back to culture. American military culture in 1966 was built around the offensive. You find the enemy, you close with the enemy, you destroy the enemy. Sitting still in the jungle, waiting for something to happen felt, to the generals in their Saigon offices, if not always to the grunts on the ground, like not doing anything, like wasting time, like not being aggressive enough. Charlie understood American aggressiveness and used it against them with considerable skill. He would set up situations designed to draw American units into prepared killing grounds. A small contact here, a trail that seemed to lead somewhere promising there. And suddenly, an American company would find itself in broken terrain that Charlie had prepared, with interlocking fields of fire. And the helicopter gunships and the fast movers, for all their tremendous power, couldn't always get there fast enough or close enough to make the difference before the damage was done. The Americans lost good men to that tactic more times than anyone in the Pentagon wanted to count. The Australians were harder to bait, partly because their smaller patrol footprint meant they were less valuable as a target. You're not going to set up an elaborate ambush for 6 men when it costs you 30 to execute it. But also because their training specifically included the recognition of enemy baiting tactics. They were taught to be suspicious of the obvious. A blood trail leading into the jungle is not an invitation to follow. It's a question. And the question is whether you're smart enough not to answer it. A seemingly abandoned enemy position with equipment left behind is not a gift. It's a test. And the test is whether your greed for intelligence outweighs your tactical judgment. The Australian SAS, more often than not, passed these tests. There was a particular engagement in 1968, and this one is documented well enough that I can speak to it with some confidence. where an Australian SAS patrol of 5 men spent 11 days in the jungle observing a major Viet Cong base area in the Hat Dik region of Phuoc Tuy. 11 days. Living on what they carried, moving only at night or in the early morning before full light. Communicating back to base on a schedule tight enough to prevent enemy direction finding of their radio signals. They mapped the base area, counted the personnel, identified the command structure from the patterns of movement they observed, located the weapon caches and the supply routes and the medical facility. When they finally extracted, quietly, the way they'd inserted, they brought back intelligence that allowed a follow-up operation to hit that base area with a precision that would have been impossible without those 11 days of patient, silent observation. Compare that to what it would have taken an American unit to gather equivalent intelligence. You'd need aerial reconnaissance, which Charlie could hear coming and would respond to by going underground. You'd need prisoner interrogation, which required capturing prisoners, which required contact, which required all the noise and violence and risk that contact entailed. You'd need informant networks, which existed, but which Charlie had spent years identifying and neutralizing with ruthless efficiency in the villages of Phuoc Tuy. The Australians walked in, watched, walked out, and knew more about that base area than Charlie probably thought anyone outside his own organization could know. That's not magic. That's craft. That's the product of selection and training and a tactical philosophy that valued knowledge over firepower. And yet, and this is the part that I think deserves more credit than it usually gets, the Australians never pretended that their approach was the only valid one. The men of the 1st Australian Task Force knew perfectly well that without American air power, American logistics, American artillery support, they couldn't have operated in Phuoc Tuy the way they did. The big American hammer, for all the criticism of it, kept certain large-scale North Vietnamese army operations from developing in the South in ways that would have overwhelmed any small unit counterinsurgency effort. The hammer and the scalpel were not competitors. They were complements. The tragedy was that the people making decisions at the strategic level never quite figured out how to use both instruments simultaneously, with the intelligence and the patience the situation required. Back in that Vung Tau bar, the American staff sergeant and the Australian SAS corporal finished their beers sometime well after midnight. The American, by his own later account, was not entirely sober, which may explain the directness of his final question. He asked the Australian, straight out the way Americans do when the beer has loosened things up, he asked, "Do you think we can win this war?" And the Australian was quiet for a long moment. Long enough that the American thought he wasn't going to answer. And then he said, "Oh, I think we could win Phuoc Tuy. Oh, I think we could win it properly, if they let us do it properly and give us enough time." He paused again. I don't know about the rest of it. That answer has stayed with me since I first heard it, because it captures something essential about Vietnam that all the books and documentaries and congressional hearings never quite managed to express as cleanly. The war wasn't one war. It was dozens of wars happening simultaneously, in different provinces, with different commanders, and different enemies, and different local dynamics. And the tragedy was that a strategy that might have worked in one place was being imposed uniformly across all of them by men who were too far from the ground to understand the difference. The Australians in Phuoc Tuy were, in many respects, winning their war. Not cleanly, not without cost, not without grief. 18 dead at Long Tan is not a small number when you know who those men were. But winning in the sense that the province was becoming more secure. The Viet Cong infrastructure was being steadily degraded, and the local population was beginning, slowly, and cautiously, to believe that the government side might actually be there to stay. And then 1971 came. The Australians went home, as they'd always known they would eventually. And everything they'd built, everything they'd learned, every relationship and every piece of hard-won knowledge about that particular piece of ground, it went with them. The Viet Cong walked back into Phuoc Tuy within months. Everything the diggers had spent 5 years building was undone in a season. Not because the Australians had failed. They hadn't failed. They'd done everything right. They'd been let down by a strategic situation that was beyond any individual unit's ability to control, no matter how skilled, or how patient, or how professional. That's the real lesson of Long Tan, and of the Australian experience in Vietnam. And it's a lesson that military planners have had to relearn in every counterinsurgency since. Tactical excellence at the small unit level, and the Australians demonstrated tactical excellence at the small unit level as well as any force in the history of modern warfare, cannot substitute for strategic clarity at the top. The scalpel, no matter how sharp, cannot do the work of a strategy. And without a strategy that the local population can believe in, and that the home population will sustain long enough for it to work, the finest soldiers in the world are ultimately just buying time. The men of D Company, 6th RAR, who stood in that rubber plantation in the driving August rain and held their ground against odds that should have destroyed them, those men deserve to be remembered. Not just as a military curiosity, not just as a footnote in the history of a war that most people in the Western world would rather forget, but as an example of what human beings are capable of when they are trained well, led well, and trusted to do their jobs. Corporal Ray Swanton, Private Noel Beckstream, Private David Thomas. 18 names on a memorial in Canberra that most people outside Australia couldn't find on a map. But those names matter. They always matter. And the men of the 275th Viet Cong Regiment who came across that wire deserve a measure of respect too, in the way that soldiers respect other soldiers who do their duty with courage, even when the outcome is terrible. They came to fight. They fought hard. They lost. That's war. And war doesn't sort its participants by nationality when it comes time to demand the ultimate price. So here's what I want to leave you with tonight, boys. The next time someone asks you what made the Australian SAS different in Vietnam, don't reach for the easy answer about toughness or training, or the particular bloody-mindedness that seems to be hardwired into anyone who grew up calling a large venomous spider a minor inconvenience. Those things are real, but they're not the whole answer. The whole answer is philosophy. The Australians went to Vietnam with a philosophical approach to warfare. Patient, quiet, knowledge first, violence as a last resort carefully prepared and precisely applied. That was the product of decades of hard experience in difficult environments against difficult enemies. They didn't invent it at Nui Dat. They brought it with them, refined it in the rubber plantations and the jungle scrub of Phuoc Tuy, and proved it at Long Tan on a rainy August night when the alternative to proving it was dying. The Americans brought something different: courage, firepower, resources, and a genuine desire to do right by the South Vietnamese people that got lost somewhere between Washington and Saigon in a fog of political calculation and institutional stubbornness. The grunts, as always, paid the price for decisions made by people who would never hear a shot fired in anger. Both things can be true simultaneously. You can honor the digger's tactical brilliance and honor the American grunt's courage and sacrifice without contradiction. The men on the ground, on both sides of the alliance, were better than the war they were given to fight. That's almost always the case. And recognizing that, really sitting with it, really letting it mean something, is maybe the most important thing any of us can do for the memory of the men who didn't come home. Now I want to hear from you, boys. Those of you who are in country, in Phuoc Tuy, in War Zone C, anywhere in that country during those years. What's your read on this? Do you think the Australian approach could have gave up? Could the Americans have adopted that kind of patient, small unit counterinsurgency philosophy across the whole theater if the brass had gotten out of the way and let the grunts do it their way? Or was the sheer scale of the American commitment, the numbers, the politics, the expectations back home, always going to force a different kind of war? Drop it in the comments. I read every one of them, and I mean that. The men who were there know things that no historian has ever written down. And this channel exists to hear those things before they're gone. See you next time, boys. Take care of yourselves.